Welcome everyone. We're just getting quite a few people joining us still. Just give it another minute and we'll get going. Well, welcome everyone. I think we'll get going. We've got a lot to get through this evening and we want to start smartly. We may well be joined by people as the meeting goes on, given that we're dividing the discussion this evening into two. It's good to have such a good attendance for our annual meeting and debate. I'm Tony Burton, I'm the chair of CPRE London. The programme for the evening is to hold our AGM. We'll do through that quickly, and that'll be followed by the Greater Green debate, where we're going to be joined by a number of speakers. I know a number of you have come to the event through the Urban Tree Festival. Hopefully you'll find the AGM element of interest. You'll learn a bit more about what CPRE London is up to, and then we'll get going on the discussion by 6:30 at the latest. We're still online. It's our second annual meeting online. The etiquette this evening is that I will move through the AGM agenda as smartly as possible, giving appropriate time for discussion. I'll pause at the different points on the agenda. Please use the chat or the Q&A function to raise any issues or ask any questions. As we move through, your silence will be taken as assent when we get to the key decision points. We are recording this meeting and it is being made available publicly. And all the papers for the AGM have been made available on our website. There's a link available which has been put into the chat if you want to access those and you haven't seen them or want to be reminded of them. On that basis, I'm going to move into the AGM. We've had a couple of apologies, including from our former chair, John Croxton. If you have any other apologies that you are aware of, if you could just put them into chat, that would be helpful, and we will record them in the minutes of the meeting, which will be obviously used at the next AGM next year. The minutes we have from our, what was a delayed meeting on the 8th of October 2020. For those of you who attended, can we take those as a correct record? I'm going to pick up a couple of issues in my report. So just to check in, everyone's happy. If not,
yes, I second this.
Thank you, Elena. I'm going to move into the annual report then from the trustees. There's a written report available. I'll just say a few words, and there's a couple of updates from the last year's meeting to touch on as well. Something of a truism, I think, these days to say the last year has been a year like no other. But what we do know is that our work's never been more important. The true value of our local countryside and our open and public space has never been more appreciated by so many people, and the demands on CPRE London have never been greater, despite the fact that we've all been working from home. During the year, we've done a lot to celebrate London's countryside. Our Go Parks London initiative now has over 4,000 listings of local green spaces. Our campaign for 10 new London parks and new radial walking routes has hit home and has won widespread support. We're in the middle of the second Urban Tree Festival, and do check out the programme and join me on Sunday afternoon for a webinar on campaigning for trees. We've over the last year provided small grants to local groups planting hedgerows, and we've worked with the Magpie project supporting mothers and children at risk of homelessness in Newham with growing spaces, and our new Rural Rides project enabling them to visit Epping Forest. We've also run the first Picture Green London photo competition, and do watch out for details of the next one, which will be available soon. As well as celebrating London's countryside, we've of course had to do a lot to protect it in the face of a variety of different threats. We now have a new London plan focused on development taking place within London's boundaries and avoiding the loss of greenbelt and metropolitan open land. We've strengthened our network of supporters on the ground, supporting campaigns with local groups across 10 boroughs. And we've joined campaigns to strengthen and not weaken the planning system as it's put up for review. We've also done what we can to hold authority to account with our Healthy Streets scorecard, never more timely as the debate over low traffic neighbourhoods and school streets went rapidly up the agenda. And most recently, we've brought together a coalition of environment, transport and other groups around the mayoral and assembly elections and the agenda from a more natural capital. None of this work and others that are recorded in the report was possible without the dedication and commitment of our very small staff team and our growing team of volunteers who are now working on everything from communications and green spaces, dark skies, supporters and volunteers. A big thank you from us all for the work that you've put in. And can I also thank all our trustees, old and new, for their support, and especially to Joe Ellingham and Poonam Douglas, who are stepping down. And we couldn't do this without the support of all our members, our donors and our funders, including our collaborations with the City Bridge Trust, with the GLA, the Integrated Transport Commission, the Magpie Project, Forestgate Community Garden, Tranquil City, Richard Tisdall Associates, and our national CPRE colleagues. I want to pick up on what was said at last year's AGM about us moving to become a charitable incorporated organisation. Following further review, the trustees are moving this forward. We can see positive advantages from incorporation as we grow and secure more grant and other funding. And we believe this is an efficient approach, which is a route already being taken by CPRE groups elsewhere in the country. We're taking advice and we're following the approaches advised by CPRE nationally and by the Charity Commission. And the trustees are currently finalising the draft of a new constitution, which will first go for agreement to CPRE nationally before we bring a resolution to members of CPRE London. We're planning to do this probably via an AGM before the end of the year, and your support then will be appreciated. And of course, we'll be happy to pick up on any issues or questions either this evening or between now and that meeting. And on that note, I'll pause and invite any questions or comments before proposing approval of the annual report. I will take your silence as assent, so I'm formally going to propose the annual report. And Elena.
Thank you, Tony. Good evening, everyone. I will
Elena,
briefly...
sorry, would you like to just second the annual report? Would that be, just so we've done that?
Yes, I second this.
Thank you. We'll now move on to Elena, who's our treasurer, for her report and the accounts.
I will briefly summarize the financial accounts and results for the last year. CPRE London's financial position has improved and its scale of activities has expanded with various new projects and initiatives. Membership income was similar to the previous year, despite the pandemic and associated restrictions on outdoor activities, including fundraising. The adverse change in income was minimal. It reduced only by 1% in comparison with the last year. Grant income amounted to more than £67,000, where the main contributors were City Bridge Trust funding the Big Green London Map and Foundation for Integrated Transport as a funder for the Healthy Streets Scorecard project. Also, the charity earned £9,250 thanks to additional activities. Therefore, total income reached more than £122,000. In terms of expenditures, the total costs increased by 18%, which was over £119,000, largely due to expenses associated with Big Green London Map and Healthy Streets Scorecard. Moreover, the team was working on other events and initiatives. Office expenses dropped by 66% because of working from home during the pandemic. As a result, we ended up with a surplus of £3,528. As a consequence, the net assets increased to over £100,000 and the year-end cash balance stood at a healthy £102,500. Taking everything into account, the charity finds itself in a strong financial position and pursues exciting new projects and continuous grant applications in 2021. Before the approval of the accounts of 2020, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Does anyone have any questions they want to raise with Elena about her report or about the accounts? Thank you, Nicholas. Good to know they're clear. I'm happy to propose those. Elena, would you like to second them?
Yes, I second it.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much for the report. And we're now going to move on to the election of trustees and honorary officers.
I think this is over to me, Tony.
It is. We've got a couple of new nominations, and Catherine's going to sort of explain how we've gone through the recruitment process and introduce things.
Yes, hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Catherine Irving Johnston, and I'm a proposed general trustee for this evening. I was involved over the last couple of months in the recruitment process. As Tony said, we had 2 resignations from the board in the last year. So alongside Danny Garvey, also proposed vice chair this evening, or deputy chair, I should say, we ran a recruitment process in April 2021 to find a new secretary and a new general trustee with a background in planning, green space and environmental policy. It was a really fair and open recruitment process conducted via a series of Zoom interviews, which I'm sure we're all very used to now. And we spoke to a number of highly qualified candidates. And after some decisions made in a really competitive pool, we're really happy this evening to be putting forward 2 very strong candidates for these roles.
Thanks, Catherine. And I think we're going to move on to the chair now.
Yes, so whilst I have the floor, I'd like to propose Tony Burton as the chair of the CPRE London board. I'd just say a few words that Tony obviously has extensive and expansive experience, having been our chair since 2019. your strength as chair stems from this very experience across numerous organisations we're all familiar with, such as the National Lottery Community Fund, Civic Voice and the National Trust. And he's an incredibly valuable asset to the CPRE London board. So therefore, I would like to propose Tony Burton as the Chair of Trustees. And I would like to ask for a seconder.
Thank you, Catherine. I second it.
Thanks, Elena.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm going to move swiftly on to get through the process for the remaining trustees and honorary officers. So our Vice Chair, Danny Garvey, who is known to us all, has been has been Vice Chair for a couple of years and been on the board for longer than that. I'm proposing Danny as Vice Chair. And Elena, I think, are you happy to second that?
Yes, I second it.
And then I'll hand back to Catherine, because Sally Penrose is our incoming secretary and was one of those recruited.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So as mentioned in the recruitment process, one of the positions was for secretary. And we were delighted to meet Sally, who spent the majority of her career in marketing and communication roles in the healthcare, management, education and publishing sectors. Following her retirement as Chief Executive of the Lymphoma Association, she's undertaken a number of voluntary and board roles. So yes, I'd like to propose Sally Penrose as the secretary. Tony, can I ask you to second?
I'm very happy to second Sally and welcome Sally to the role. And moving on to Treasurer, well, we've just heard from Elena, a very clear presentation of the report on the accounts, which are in good shape. And I'm really happy to be proposing Elena Kalashnikova to be our Treasurer for the coming year.
And I second that one.
And we're going to move on to the other trustees, the general trustees as we call them, where we have Tara Jane Sutcliffe and Emma Bald, who are known to you. Catherine, who you're just seeing at the moment, who was co-opted during the year and is being put forward for the first time. And a new trustee, one of those that's been recruited for the process that Catherine's described, John Burke. There's details of all four of the proposals for joining us as trustees in the information that's been previously circulated. We've got no more nominations than we have vacancies, so there's no need for any wider ballot. And I'm very happy to be proposing those four to join us as general trustees.
And I second these.
And just checking in that no one's got any issues with any of the proposals and secondings and the individuals who are now being put forward to join us as trustees and honorary officers. Thanks very much, everybody. And thanks to Danny and Catherine for managing the process of the recruitment, which has led to such excellent candidates this evening. Going to move on to the appointment of our independent examiner, which I'd like to propose the appointment of Judith Brookfield for the 4th year as our independent examiner. You've seen the accounts, and this will need seconding if someone would like to do that.
Yes, I'm happy to second it.
And just check there's no issue. Thank you to Elena. With that, with anybody? If not, delighted that Judith will be our independent examiner for another year, a year where there'll be, we're anticipating change because of the move to being a charitable incorporated organisation. So we'll look at the consequences of that as the year unfolds. So just to notify you of the likely date of the next AGM on the 19th of May 2022. And with a bit of luck, we'll be doing that in person. And to move to any other business, just can I see if there's anyone wants to raise anything under any other business? Please do use the Q&A if you have anything you would like to raise at this stage. I'll just pause for any typing to be going on? If there are no issues, of course, always feel free to be in touch with us using the office@cprelondon.org.uk email address, and we'll do our best to deal with any issues or questions that you raise. On that basis, unless anyone has any issue they want to raise, I propose to draw the 2021 AGM of CPRE London to a close. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Metaphorically, stand up, turn around, and we're going to move on to the second part of the evening, which is a part of the Urban Tree Festival. Do look at the programme. It's running this week. Been an amazing, extraordinary programme of events, I have to say. And we've been curating a series of tree rings seminars, which culminate with one on campaigning for trees, which I'm hosting on Sunday afternoon. And welcome particularly to those of you who joined us and found CPRE London through the Urban Tree Festival. The theme of the discussion is From Grey to Green, Repurposing London Streets. And for CPRE London, the debate, the discussion is triggered by recent research, which will be touched on, showing just how much space in London is given over to parking cars and the better alternatives that we believe are available. Space is at a premium in a city like London, especially when you're trying to avoid urban sprawl and make London an attractive place to live. And so we're asking the question this evening, whether we need to rethink our priorities and how much space we need to be giving over to the grey infrastructure of roads and streets and parking, when we know how good the green infrastructure is for our quality of life. We've got an impressive panel of speakers lined up, and you can see them on the screen. And as before, as we go through the discussions, if you want to raise any issues or ask any questions, then please use the Q&A function. We'll probably take those issues at the end after people have spoken, but slightly depends on how the discussion unfolds. And each of the presenters is going to has a set of slides which they will be sharing with us. And you can see who they are and where they come from on the screen. And I think that will be clear once we get into the presentations. So I'm going to ask Stephen if he'd like to kick off, and we'll put Stephen's slides up.
Hi there, everybody. I'm Stephen Edwards, and I'm Director of Policy and Communications at Living Streets, the charity for everyday walking. Our mission is to achieve a better walking environment and to inspire people to walk more. So I'm really going to address this subject from the perspective of the work we've done across the UK to improve the walking environment. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the national context, and then kind of set out some of the big themes we see emerging from the activism and campaigning work we're doing at a national level. So next slide, please. So just to start off, it's a really exciting time for walking and for this agenda, generally speaking. As Tony was saying, many more people have discovered walking during the last year, during the pandemic, and that has really heightened the importance of all of the work we're doing. People have been visiting their local parks, their canals, their town centres on foot, and appreciating their local neighbourhoods in a way that they haven't done before. And government has responded to this, and there's been record investment in walking and cycling from government over the last 12 months. The 2 billion investment we saw announced last year represents the largest investment we've seen for active travel ever, and is also hopefully going to be sustained over a number of years as well. And we also see in our work consensus over the benefits of walking for environment and health. And I don't need to remind everyone here of the countless scientific papers that really highlight the benefits of walking and the benefits of green spaces for physical and mental health. So moving on to the next slide. Walking clearly has so much to offer. It's kind of zero carbon, zero emissions, it's free, it makes great use of our space, and it's good for our health as well. But in the work we do, we find it's so often undervalued and is not something people look at in conventional, and when we operate given our conventional economic thinking. The time really is to act now, given the need to significantly reduce carbon emissions if we're going to meet the government's zero emissions target and kind of slow down the catastrophic climate change we're all experiencing at the moment. But moving on to the next slide, I think I want to sound a bit of a warning bell here. I don't want to dampen it all down, but there are risks in the environment that we need to bear in mind. That the fiscal environment remains uncertain. As we all know, the budget deficit's around kind of £303 billion, 15% of GDP, and government has been very clear that it's going to have to address that at some point in the future. So we need to be alive to the need to constantly remake the case around the importance of green infrastructure. And as you all know, car journeys and air pollution is already back at pre-pandemic levels, rather concerningly. But moving on to the next slide. In all of this, London, next slide, please. Thank you. In all of this, London is critically important. Londoners drive 4 billion more miles than a decade ago. The research we've conducted shows that pedestrians account for more than half of street fatalities in London. And really sadly, pedestrians from deprived communities and from Black and ethnic minority communities account for a large proportion of that as well. And we all know that poor air quality contributes to many, many deaths in London each year. So I think on balance, there is a real need to continue to address this agenda. For my remaining 5 minutes, I just want to talk about some of the pillars of change as we see it. So on to the next slide. 3 things I want to cover off very quickly. One is the levelling up agenda. We hear a lot about this from government. What does it mean? I'm going to take it as meaning the need to tackle health, economic and social inequalities and talk about how we can do that in this agenda. Secondly, the need to increase active journeys, how we can do that. And then thirdly, how we can motivate and engage those voices for change. And I'll talk about a bit of the work that some of our local groups do in this space. So on to the next slide, please. And first of all, on the levelling up agenda. So the slide has gone slightly funny, but I think that doesn't matter. The tackling inequalities really matters when we plan street improvements. The research out there shows that the richest 10% of the population receive almost 4 times as much public spending on their transport as the poorest 10%. And sadly, whilst lockdown has kind of seen many of us rediscover our spaces, it has exacerbated some of the challenges around inequality, particularly around older people and social isolation. Some of the data that I mentioned earlier on, some research that we've conducted that's just been published today, showing that pedestrians from deprived ethnic minority communities over 3 times more likely to be injured on Britain's roads than white non-deprived pedestrians. And there's been some worrying trends that we can see in Sport England statistics around activity levels for older adults and for people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds during the pandemic as well. So what does this mean for walking environments, for our green environments? I think it really highlights the need for short-term improvements to the walking environment to be spread across all of our communities and not just kind of the better off kind of middle income communities that we often think of as benefiting from these schemes. But on to the next slide, please. I think the positive thing though is there is research showing that these benefits are being spread across the whole of the country and across all of our communities. Rachel Aldred at the University of Westminster has very recently published some research showing that in London in particular, people in the most deprived quarter of areas are 3 times more likely to live in one of the new low traffic neighbourhoods that's been introduced than in the kind of in more wealthy groups. And people without cars are more likely to live in areas where space has been redistributed towards lower traffic systems or greener spaces than in kind of other groups. The picture overall in London so far is mixed though, and I really commend the work that Tony mentioned earlier on, the Healthy Streets scorecard work that CPRE London has led, that London Living Streets, LCC, Wills for Wellbeing and others have been involved in. Really great piece of research showing which boroughs are doing well and which ones aren't doing so well. Kind of on to the next slide, please. If we skip this one, move on to the next one. Thanks. So my second theme was around increasing active journeys by strategically planning around different groups, whether it be schools, workplaces or older adults. And Living Streets are doing some great work across London, addressing physical activity levels, social isolation and air pollution and the like. On to the next slide, please. And it's a great week to be talking to you because this week is Walk to School Week. And we are working with countless local authorities and schools across the country and have seen thousands and thousands of pupils across the UK travelling actively to school this week, taking advantage both of behaviour change programmes like our WOW programme, but also looking at some of the infrastructure change that has enabled people to benefit from more green infrastructure and kind of lower traffic solutions going forward. And then my final theme was, on the next slide, please, was around voices for change. And I want to take a really, really brief look at how we take communities along with us on this journey. There has undoubtedly been a backlash in some places, although there's a question mark that perhaps we can discuss when we come on to the discussion about how representative some of the fierce debates we see on social media are of the reality of public perception, especially given some of the opinion research that we've produced and the DFT and others have produced. We really need to ensure that the people who benefit from positive change are able to speak up. And I really pay tribute to the great work our local groups do and CPRE local groups do across the country and across London to ensure that those positive voices can come forward. So on to the next slide. We really specialise in working with these groups to help decision makers to hear from local voices. And I'll just finish off really quickly on the next slide with kind of a couple of examples. One is some of the fantastic work that our Hackney Living Streets group has done to campaign to encourage parklets, repurposing parking spaces and replacing them with seats, tables, planting boxes to extend the street and reclaim some of the grey space for green space. And then finally, on the last slide, our kind of two of our great volunteers, David Harrison and Emma Griffin, have done some brilliant work mapping the central, what they've called the Central London Footways Network. This really has built a network of quiet and interesting streets that people can walk on throughout London. I think the really interesting thing about this, though, is it doesn't only show people where they can walk and show the short walking distances between places, it also highlights the bits that are missing on that walking and that green network. So where are the crossings that haven't been put in place properly or are too dangerous? Where are the streets with too much traffic? Where do we need more 20-mile-per-hour speed limits? And I think what this really highlights to me is that whilst we've made a lot of progress over the last few years, there's still a lot to be done. And we need to continue working hard and campaigning hard if we're to kind of achieve much more in the years to come. So that's all for me, and look forward to hearing the rest of the debate.
Stephen, thank you. That's really helpful, and you've prompted a few themes there, which I think we'll be able to pick up later on in the discussion. I'm going to move us on to Alice Roberts, who's our very own head of campaigns at CPRE London, and particularly behind the Healthy Streets work, among all sorts of other things that she's doing. So Alice, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tony. I hope you can hear me okay. I can't really tell, so
we can hear you fine, and we can see your screen. Great,
thank you very much. So yes, I want to talk to you today about one of our latest campaigns, which is called Grey to Green, which is very much an extension of the work that we already do. So first of all, I just quickly say what we mean by grey space. So Really, grey space is just roads with the parking beside it, streets, a residential street here, car parks, surface car parks. This is a particularly large one here. This is a particularly large road, so I'm just showing you here how many, sometimes roads are very large with very many lanes. That one has 6 lanes across it. That's near Regent's Park. And this is Market Square in Enfield, which many times is a car park. So that's what we mean by grey space, essentially roads and parking. And I just want to quickly say how we came to talk about, or how the Grey to Green campaign really came about, and why it's so important to us. Why is grey space so important to us? And really this is an extension of our work around trying to make sure that we don't build on green spaces and that we don't push out into the green belt. So can we use grey space for housing and other development needs in London? Yes, we can. Can we use grey space to tackle the lack of green space in London? London only having half the green space that it needs. Yes, we can. Can we create healthier streets and use grey space to shift away from car trips, reduce air and noise pollution, carbon emissions, and yes, and so forth? Yes, we can. More generally, London's public realm, can we use grey space to improve our public realm? Yes. Can we use grey space to help manage rain and temperature? Yes, we can. I'll show you some examples of that. And more generally, just the visual amenity of where we live. Can we live in a park rather than living in a car park? So all of these things are really important to CPRE London, and all of them point to the need for reallocation of grey space. So we started talking about parking a year or so ago with this publication, which you can find online, which showed 8 ways to transform parking and make London a better place. So the picture on the front shows Alfred Place in Camden, where they're planning to turn the street into a park. This one shows the Coliseum Retail Park in Enfield, for which planning permission is, I think, about to go in or has just gone in to create a very large new neighbourhood. It's such a huge space that they're able to put residential and commercial in there, thus hopefully saving some of Enfield's green belt, although that's a story I'll come back to. This is a street which has been turned into a park. This is quite a well-known example of Van Gogh Walk in Lambeth. So up here you see when it was a street, down here you see now it's become a play space with kids playing basketball down here. And this space on the left is in Amsterdam, where part of the street has been taken to enable kids to play safely. Parking can be removed from one side or the other side of a street to create safe cycle routes, although this one doesn't have safe segregated track, but I think it's actually got segregated track now, that street. And also at the beginning of the pandemic, when it was actually sunny last year, when we started to realise that our pavements are just not big enough. Often they certainly weren't big enough for social distancing very often, but more generally they're very often not even wide enough to walk side by side with just one other person. So you can take parking space to widen pavements too. And that would be walking infrastructure in more technically. So here we have Enfield again. So this was a proposal which I think was funded to improve the public realm in the Market Square in Enfield, although I think it might still be being used at a car park some of the time, unfortunately. So things moving fast though, and not necessarily, unfortunately, in the right direction. So the things that are happening now have led us to want to talk about this even more. So I'm going to talk quickly through this. So this is the latest report from Enfield, which is a proposal from Coma Homes to build on all of these spaces, which are greenbelt. Enfield's preparing its local plan, and we are campaigning locally to say that they should not be building in the greenbelt when there are endless spaces like this, and there really are some very large spaces in Enfield which could be repurposed, and many of which they are looking to repurpose. So that's good news, but the pressure is still on, and that's not good news. This is Hounslow. This is a large piece of greenbelt in Hounslow, which you can also see up here. which, believe it or not, has a scheduled monument, a Neolithic causeway just here on it. And this, they are trying to de-designate from greenbelt land and allocate for development, although I think the scheduled monument might be not in those plans, but the rest of it unfortunately is. And of course, this is to in part accommodate development at Heathrow, despite the fact that, as this slide shows, there's an enormous amount of surface car parking around Heathrow, which could accommodate other things. So yeah, so even though it's over the border in Hillingdon, that doesn't necessarily, from our point of view, mean that that shouldn't be redeployed. This is a street in Hackney, Culverston Crescent, which for which I think funding has now been agreed to turn it into a park, and this is the plans for that. So that's really good news. The organisation Possible, which is climate change campaigners, are campaigning for traffic-free town centres around London, and this is a great example here of well, I just took this picture 2 days ago. I should have taken it 1 day ago because the trees had gone in yesterday. So this is where in Hackney again, that's largely because I live in Hackney and I'm cycling around. So this is before and this is after, and you can see that that's taking up green space in order to help to manage rainfall and to plant trees. So yeah, so more recently we've launched our Greater Green campaign, and this is really to challenge everyone. We want everyone to go out there and think about how their streets could change, put together proposals for changes to their street, and go and take them to their local councillors. And bear in mind that there are elections going on in London next May. So here is the kind of things that you might propose. So here you can, I'm going to skip through these really quickly because I don't have much time, but you can see all of these on our website. So here this road's been changed to incorporate walking and cycling infrastructure and greenery. This is a very simple one that that we did as part of our Hackney Downs low traffic neighbourhood, which is just to add in a zebra crossing there with a build out to make it easier to cross for pedestrians and kids going to the children's centre, and to introduce 20-mile-per-hour limits because it's a main road. This is Bromley Living Streets, who we've been helping to put together plans to create cycle routes and better infrastructure on Croydon Road. This is Dragoon Road in Lewisham, which we hope will, which they're campaigning to become something like this, which that's not a before and after, it's something that they're hoping to do with that road, so make better use of that space. This is a shopping street with wine bars, and we're working with the wine bar here to create a visualization for changes to enable them to have more space for people to sit out in the street and enjoy the street environment more. And if all of that seems far too complicated, then you could just create a little parklet outside your house, or campaign. Join the London Parklet campaign to, this is my parklet, and sorry, that's not a great picture. This is my parklet and it's looking very nice. So yes, so Greater Green is really a call to action. And one thing that I just wanted to show you is that we feel that we should not just ask others to do it, but to do it ourselves. So as I cycle down to work, I cycle down this way, I get this amazing view of St. Paul's, and as I go through those traffic lights and towards the end, I meet a space, which is this space. And this is an incredibly historic space, but it's really just, it's just doing nothing. It's just got parked motorbikes and parked cars and lots of a very wide road. And yet this space was incredibly old. Cowcross Street here appears in the map from the 1500s, this wide space here. And here it is with a magistrate's court on it called Hicks Hall sometime later. And there it is now, looking slightly more sorry for itself and very grey. So this is the aerial view, and this is our plans that we hope to begin. So this is the first time I've shown anyone these. So this is what we want to do with our campaign. And so we've picked a street near our office, and we would like you all to do something similar. So please propose changes to streets and town centres near you, take them to your local councillors, remember the local elections in May of next year, and contact us if you'd like help. I'm very happy to hear from you. That's me.
Whew. Brilliant, Alice, thank you. Wow, that's a lot going on, a lot of ideas of what can be done, which I think again is something which we will come back to. And thanks, Alice, for all you're doing on that for CPOE London. Hugely appreciated, I'm sure, by everyone on the call. We're going to move swiftly on to Ben Connor from the GLA to give us GLA take on these issues.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks a lot for the invite to speak. Hopefully everyone can see my screen okay. Can you confirm that you can see it okay?
It's looking good, yep.
Great. So my name's Ben Connor. I work in the environment team at the Greater London Authority at City Hall, and specifically work in the green infrastructure team. So I'll be coming at these issues from that perspective. In my 10 minutes, I'm going to first just give a bit of context about the challenges and opportunities for urban greening in London and talk about our policies at the London-wide level. And then talk a little bit more about one particular piece of work that we're doing, which will hopefully help to make the case for turning grey to green. So firstly, and I'm sure everyone in this audience knows this, but I think it bears reiterating anyway, that London is a very green city by global and national standards. So our green cover mapping that we did a few years ago using aerial imagery suggests that between 48 and 51% of London is green cover in some form. So it's not just accessible green space, but gardens, green roofs, woodlands. And this is a legacy both of the history of the city's development and the history of strong policies that have protected green space pretty well. However, there are three pressures, I think, that we face in the context of protecting and increasing the amount of green space in London. First, and it's already been touched on, we have a growing population coupled with a housing crisis, which means that there is development pressure. And because of the rightly strong protections in the main that we have for green belt and existing green spaces, we know that new development in London will be denser. So how do we build the houses that London needs whilst protecting and increasing green space? A caveat to that, of course, is it remains to be seen exactly what impact COVID and potentially Brexit has on those trends. And some early data, suggested a fall in London's population in 2020. So whether that is just a blip or a longer trend, and is an interesting question. Second, the environmental pressures of the climate emergency and air pollution. In particular, the increased risk from the urban heat island effect and extreme heat, and from flooding as rainstorms become more frequent and more intense. And that means not just that we need our green space more than ever, but also it requires us to think about how we manage it and design it differently to adapt to these challenges. Our green spaces of the future may need to look and feel different to those in the past. And third, and as shown in the picture, COVID has brought this into really sharp focus and to wider attention, is the issue that this green space that we do have in London is very unevenly distributed. So around half of households in London live in what's classed as an area of deficiency in access to open space, so more than 400 metres away. And Black, Asian and minority ethnic Londoners and poorer Londoners are more likely to live in those areas. And as the pandemic has shown, this uneven access to green space, it's not just an environmental issue, but it's a matter of social justice and health inequality, and something that we really need to tackle. So how do we tackle these challenges? So we do have a strong policy framework at the London-wide scale. Although in some areas the mayor's direct powers are limited, the GLA has no direct control over green spaces. There are three main levers for change. So firstly, the London Environment Strategy, published in 2018, which has a good headline target for 50% of London to be green in 2050, so maintaining or increasing what we have now. Secondly, the London Plan, which was finally published earlier this year, which has strong protections for the green belt and for existing open spaces, and also introduces a new urban greening factor policy, the first in a major city, that uses a scoring system to ensure that major new developments include greening and that they will score more highly for high quality greening that responds to local needs. And thirdly, and especially important for this discussion, is the Mayor's transport strategy, which outlines the target for a significant modal shift so that 80% of all journeys are made by active travel or by public transport by 2041. And it also outlines the Healthy Streets approach, and we've heard about the work that CPRE has been doing on that. There are 10 indicators that are about making streets appealing places to walk, cycle, and spend time, and making streets greener is absolutely key to that. So whilst we have a supportive policy framework, and one that's particularly good at protecting existing green spaces and ensuring that there's green infrastructure and new developments, increasing the amount of green space in London, especially where it is most needed in those densest neighbourhoods, remains a huge challenge. In many areas of London, there simply isn't space to create large new green spaces in the traditional way, outside of exceptional opportunities, for example, like the Olympic Park. And so at City Hall and the GLA, we promote a green infrastructure approach. So thinking about how we can create a network, not just of traditional parks and green spaces, but of street trees, of green roofs, of sustainable drainage, of waterways, that is embedded throughout the city and delivers multiple benefits to people. So ultimately, that it's a critical infrastructure vital for Londoners' well-being. One area of work that we've been developing to help make the case for making London greener is by using a natural capital approach to quantify and value the benefits that this green infrastructure provides. So a couple of years ago, we published a natural capital account for London's green spaces, which suggests that London's parks provide benefits worth £5 billion a year, including 950 million a year in avoided health costs. And similarly, London's iTree Eco Assessment, as shown on the slide, found that London's urban forest, its 8 million trees, provide benefits worth £133 million a year, including pollution removal, carbon sequestration, and more. So in the context of today's discussion, we've been interested in exploring the question of how we might understand the potential benefits and the potential value to Londoners of greening the capital's streets. So we've been working with Vivid Economics and Barton Wilmot on a project to look at this in more detail to help build the case for why we should green the grey. And I'll talk a bit about some of the initial findings today. You may have seen last summer, the National Trust published some research, as shown on the slide, working with the same consultants that argued for a £5.5 billion investment in urban green infrastructure that could deliver £200 billion worth of health and wellbeing benefits to the most deprived communities across the UK. That suggested a programme including upgrading existing parks, creating new country parks in the urban fringe, as well as greening streets and converting streets to new green spaces in areas of greatest need, including in London. An example there on the screen of that pocket park is one that we funded through our Greener City Fund a couple of years ago and should be starting on the ground very shortly. So the first thing that we've kind of done with this project, we've asked the consultants to dig into the figures for London in a bit more detail with a focus on those street greening projects. And that research identifies that greening 2,342 kilometres of streets in the greyest areas of London could potentially cost about 176 million with an annual maintenance cost of 136 million, but could deliver nearly £4 billion a year of social and environmental benefits. However, it's important to recognise that while this gives a great indication of the potential, it's still at a very theoretical level. So how does this break down into actual tangible projects that can be delivered in real locations, like some of the examples that were shown by other speakers? So the next stage of the research that we're undertaking at the moment is to look at 3 real-life scenarios of streets, working with London boroughs, and to look at how they could be transformed by removing some or all of vehicle traffic, installing sustainable drainage, planting street trees, and creating parks on streets. So we've been talking to 3 boroughs that are kind of planning, scoping out, or are interested in testing out some of these ideas to look at theoretical scenarios and using location-based data to estimate the number of people who might use and pass through the space, to calculate potential benefits in terms of mental and physical health, storing carbon and amenity value. And the example on the slide, which is from an inner London borough, is the one which so far in our analysis has come out as potentially the most beneficial, where £4 million capital investment
Just see if Ben comes back. Ben, are you there? Is Ben there? If not, then why don't we move on to Will and Mac, and then we can bring Ben back as we've got time.
That works for us.
Are you okay doing that? Can you access the screen? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello. So my name is Matt Gilchrist. I'm the executive producer and creator of the Edible Bus Stop, and I'm presenting today with my former colleague, Will Sandy, now of Will Sandy Design. We wanted to give you a whistle-stop tour of how we believe playful design and meaningful community engagement can transform grey spaces into valuable green places for neighbourhoods and real assets. People want to be involved. They want to actually have a sense of ownership and feel that responsibility. So this is an example of a particularly bleak site that, through engaging with local community, as you can see on the top row, was transformed within a year as a guerrilla garden. Eventually, through Mayor of London's Pocket Park funding, we transformed the site with local community design into a permanent site now. It's known as the Curb Garden and is now fully run by local volunteers, and it looks after itself quite literally with their love, and is considered a real gem in the local neighborhood. You can also do something just for one day if you want to inspire people. A bit like Car Free Day, International Parking Day encourages you to take over parking bays, and then in our case, get a team of creatives together, and with a lot of planning, in the space of about 2 hours one morning, we transformed these parking bays into something far more playful to actually stop people in their tracks as they were walking to Waterloo Station. This was in the South Bank. And these interventions, even if they are there just for one day, can get people to think about what they might like to see there in future. And it's sort of, this in particular, we wanted to not only just transform them through gardening, but we wanted to use musical performers. We've got street performers here. There was all sorts of really playful elements there. Even an eco-friendly fashion show was one of the installations we had in the parking bays. So another example of taking a very bleak site, this is one in West Norwood, and utilising the then Mayor in London's Pocket Park programme. We held community engagement, get a tone of what they wanted for this site. And then when it comes to the planting, you always, as best you can, utilise the children. And we transformed that into utilising the existing bollards that were there at that site to create circular planters. So it was like a game of hoopla. And this site, as you can see, the net increase of biodiversity is really quite significant from what it started out as. So we were very fortunate in the Mayor of London's funding at that time, and also Lambeth offered match funding. Another example of something that we did, we were originally engaged by Vauxhall One to just transform this former car park that was now disused, and it was the fire brigades, for 1 month. But once we started, once the gates opened and people were allowed to actually use this space, what happened is that within days, councillors were getting bombarded with calls and emails from locals saying, we want this to stay. So eventually it actually stayed there for about 5 months. And thanks to the local fire brigade, who you see watering in the top centre photo, the garden stayed alive. And again, it's an example of how we used an approach where we collaborated with cross-disciplinary creatives. And so we had, in that case, a sculpture artist come along and also be part of this garden. This one was far cheaper to achieve than the pocket parks, but had just the same kind of impact in the sense that the community were really inspired when they saw this. I think this is possibly a perfect segue for me to pass over to Will and talk about the systems that he worked on while he was still with us at the Edible Bus Stop.
Thanks, Mac. Yeah, so I think what's been interesting through the work we've been doing is looking at how prototyping and testing is still quite an uncommon idea within the built environment, yet can provide quite an interesting way to minimize disruption using off-site construction techniques to create a modular movable system of parts. And I think when we've been reevaluating our relationship with public spaces and looking at these new low traffic neighborhoods and the parklets that are popping up, what this idea provides is actually a temporary measure that you can start to move around and test ideas, adopting the idea that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And also in this industry, we don't like to get things wrong, but I think we've got to make mistakes to really understand and see spaces with fresh eyes. And I think the low traffic neighborhoods have started to really open some creative discourse, let's put it that way. Next slide, please, Matt. And so we've been developing this over the last few years, and this was a competition entry for the Smarter City with the city centre and City of London, where we looked at how we could kind of disrupt the greening of the last mile in the square mile and consider how all these vans are moving around the city, delivering parcels. How could we create a kind of hub space for them to deliver, but also make them into a kind of the village green, or that kind of idea of the village shop, making them more than just a collection point and offering a lot more green connections and joining the dots with existing spaces, creating test beds for the city and an idea of meaningful meanwhile, rather than a kind of beer and burger model. This is about testing ideas that have the idea that they can inform and influence, perhaps even inspire the discussions, and then perhaps even lead into permanent design, rather than perhaps reports that do good and they are very good at influencing at higher level. This is about working with communities at the ground to see how they can start to use the spaces and reconfigure them for themselves. Next slide, please. So this took me onto the Catalyst Cube. Next slide, please, Matt. Which was a commission by the British Council with a project called Reframing Spaces. And it looked to reinvigorate public spaces in the city of Caracas in Venezuela, South America. A city going through, or country going through, some very tricky times, but one that still wants to make change. And it was really interesting working at a grassroots level, working with local architects, communities, and students to understand how we could create catalysts for change through urban design interventions that started to create a focal point, an instant piece of urban design that started to have discussions, create a mobile kind of conversation. Next slide, please, Matt. And so we prototyped this in November 2019, and it's already made a huge impact, as you'll see in the slides to follow, where it's hosted a program of cultural activities and engagements, some of which we didn't anticipate. And the beauty of the scheme is that it's ultimately reconfigurable and it can host exhibitions, teaching, sports. We had one of the first green roofs in the city of Caracas. And it's again about creating connections through nature, but also asking people to see the space through fresh eyes. And maybe once it's gone and moved around the city, they actually start to go, well, actually, that didn't quite work, or maybe we can adopt an element of that. And it can then, each community can teach one another. So it becomes an asset for the community, the client, or the council that it's sat within, to really start to quickly test ideas and get things moving. Next slide, please, Matt. And so it really is a multifunctional space and a reusable asset. What Mac and I have been working on over the years is how these kind of pop-up or parklet spaces are really site-specific, and these ideas really become more usable, and you can start to leave a trail or start to inform the permanent public realm and get it right with not very much upfront costs, so that you can go, oh, this works, let's keep it. More seating, more planting, suds, various other elements, and the community can help you work that, so you can try all these things and then move them to the next site. And you can almost go to the next site and say, well, don't even bother trying that. We did that, didn't work. What surprised us is this. Something that surprised us, or surprised me from the UK, was the piñata hook. Something I hadn't anticipated, but something that was in high demand in South America. So these are all things, it became like a Rubik's Cube for the community that they started to just adjust for every time, whether it was 24 hours, throughout the month, or throughout the year. And this has been there for over a year and a half now moving around the city. So it's been really exciting. I've got a minute left. Next slide, please, Mac. And something I've been exploring again is looking at hybrid space. We've got all these digital technologies. We've got various ways of communicating. We've got various ways to capture data. So it doesn't just have to be a tactile piece of furniture in isolation. It can start to really have conversations online, whether that be through hashtags, other capturing pieces of information about health data, mobile data, which some of the other guys within the panel have been talking about. So I've been bringing it back here to have conversations with the likes of Grosvenor, British Land, various councils, even creative institutions. We've been pitching the idea that this could become a kind of mobile place for the tape. So it could go into communities to become a visible narrative and part of their community. So it breaks down those barriers and gets people to cross thresholds that they might not be able to. And ultimately it testbeds future moves and changes in the physical and social fabric in quick time. Perfect timing, 4 seconds. So thank you very much. And yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. A whistle-stop tour it was.
A brilliant tour though. I love the idea of just doing stuff and then people loving it so much they don't want it taken away. It's really, really interesting stuff. Now, we lost you, Ben. But I think we've got you back.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think I was probably talking to myself for about another minute.
Well, we'd love you to talk to us and finish what you said. You just told us it was all good value for money. So, and we're getting into the details. So, do return to your slides and finish off the presentation.
Okay, can you see those slides? Okay.
We can, yes.
Okay, great. And sorry for that, everyone. I think it was my internet cut out. So to pick up, I'm not quite sure where I got cut off, but essentially the research we've been undertaking, we're starting now to look at some 3 kind of potential real life scenarios of streets that are potential candidates for being transformed by removing vehicle traffic, by installing sustainable drainage, planting street trees and creating street park areas. So we're looking at potentially feasible costed interventions that boroughs are planning, are scoping out, or are interested in testing. And the research, the model that we're using, uses location-based data to estimate the number of people who might use and pass through the space, to calculate the potential benefits in terms of mental and physical health, carbon sequestration, and amenity value. And the example in the image, which is from one of the inner London boroughs that we've been working for, from the 3 scenarios we're looking at, looks like the most beneficial from an initial analysis, where a £4 million capital investment could potentially deliver up to £7 million of benefits each year, mainly in health benefits. So overall, the analysis is showing that using this approach, these projects have the potential to deliver significant benefits and to break even using this methodology in a short period of time. And they also show that where green streets are modelled in areas with the worst access to green space, their potential benefits are significantly higher. So we'll be continuing to work on this research, and the final report should be published in the next month or so, which we hope will add to the evidence base to help make the case for turning grey to green. I think having this conversation today is very timely as we start to recover from the impacts of COVID-19. And the Mayor has been very clear that this has to be a green recovery with the idea of a Green New Deal at its centre. It's really important that as we review, as Transport for London and boroughs review some of these temporary schemes that have been installed through the Street Space programme, and they've been really successful. And as they start to look to make those permanent, we have an opportunity to think not only about how we can deliver on the active travel and the air quality agenda, but also maximise the opportunities to make London greener and more climate resilient as well. That's something that I'm looking forward to working on in the next few months. Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. Apologies that it was in 2 parts.
No problem at all, and really helpful. Thank you. Thanks, Ben. And as you say, timely, given where we are and given the decisions which are now going to be made over the next few months with the new mayor and the rest. Sarah, can we move on to Sarah Bowie?
We sure can. Hi, everyone. I should have my screen shared now.
Yep, we can see that.
Awesome. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, everyone, for having me. I think I'm your final speaker. I know I'm like potentially the last thing between you and getting all of your questions answered and dinner and other wonderful things that are happening in your evening. So I'll try and keep this as quick and interesting as I can. I want to take a little bit of a different tack to what the speakers here have done so far tonight, and it's been, you know, such a privilege to get to speak on a panel of so many people who have done interventions in this city that I adore, and to hear the stories behind them. We've heard a lot about what councils can do and what organisations can do and what companies can do to support greening in London. I'm going to talk about what communities can do and basically what happens when councils and organisations and different groups just make space for people to own their own public space. And that's what's happened in Brixton recently. If I haven't met many of you folks before, and I'm sure I wouldn't, my name is Sarah Berry. I'm an active travel campaigner, and I became so after Lambeth installed a low traffic neighbourhood in my local community. This is the map of it here. I lived on a road in Railton LTN that had previously been a massive rat run full of traffic, and we had a really good community there, a really good and close network of neighbours, but we didn't spend much time together because, to be honest, being outside and hanging out in our front gardens just wasn't particularly nice, because there were always cars sort of trying to get past. The road wasn't wide enough for them, so there was honking and there was yelling, and sometimes there was fighting, and it was all just very awful. And all of that really changed when the low traffic neighbourhood came into effect. So what I want to talk to you about now is sort of what happens when you take some of the traffic out of the equation naturally without any sort of council intervention. So this is Barnwell Road. This is the street that I used to live on. And this is the end of it where it intersects with Railton Road, where a lot of the traffic filters were put in. As you can see, this is a pretty miserable looking space. On the right hand side there's a laundromat just on that corner that you can't see, and a day spa a little bit further along, but otherwise there are no businesses. It's all residential. And you can see here basically a lot of grey, a lot of things that speak to the title of tonight's sort of theme. A lot of grey, a lot of brick, and a lot of space for fly tipping, essentially. And one of the things that happened when the low traffic neighbourhood went into effect that, to be honest, I didn't predict, and I probably should have, was the fact that as our street became a hell of a lot quieter, people were all of a sudden a lot more enthusiastic about thinking of ways that we could make the outside sort of communal public spaces a bit nicer, that we could spend time in. And at first that looked like this. The introduction of a bench alongside the wall that was shared by the laundromat. The man who runs that, his name is Bravo, he helped building all of the benches and the planters, and we had a landscape gardener who lived on the street who filled them with plants and advised people on, you know, what could sort of grow there and what might fit there, and what things might look nice and how that might work. And then obviously once the little bench had gone in and the plants went there and we were all going there for coffee in the morning or for a drink in the afternoon, we started talking about how, you know, we all had some extra plants that potentially we could put in this space and that we could expand it further. So a little bit down the line, you know, more and more pot plants and different plants were appearing up the street, and it was starting to grow. And that continued to expand across the road when someone decided that they could build another little bench across on the other side of the street, add some plants in. These Wellingtons are super glued onto the planter there that's got a trellis growing up it, and future plans for some climbers to go in there. And then, much to everyone's great disappointment, the sort of weekend after all of that intervention had gone in, someone decided to fly tip a bed frame and a mattress in the area that had historically always been used for fly tipping, but we'd sort of hoped now that we'd made it so nice that it wouldn't be. But never fear, the ever ingenious Bravo came up with the idea that we could just take the bed frames and turn them into more benches. So there he is there, and he spent the weekend again with a bunch of local residents who lived on the street, turning that into some benches and a place for people extra place for people to sit down and to chat. And now it's very, very rare that you'll ever go past what is now being called Barnwell Gardens and is marked on Google Maps as Barnwell Gardens, without seeing all of the benches there and all of the spaces full of people who are either, you know, walking their kids to nursery that's on the street, or who are going towards Brixton Station, which is along this road, and on the way in their commute and stopping and having a phone conversation or a coffee or something on the way. the most recent introduction that literally I had to put this in while others were speaking because it just happened, is this introduction. There was complaints from the local younger kids that there was nowhere for them to sit down and hang out when their parents were talking at the planters. So there has been built a little picnic table, especially designed for young children and small toddlers, that will obviously be filled out with some plants as they become available. But this is, as Ben and as Michaela were referencing, you know, these are ever evolving spaces that are adapting according to the needs of the local community and are being done without permission, without intervention, without help, without funding, without any of those things, just off the back of the local community. And this is just one street. It's happened in other places. You'll see on the bottom, this is a pop-up parklet that's happened in Rattray Gardens, where not only is there sort of all of these plants and all of these different decorations that have been put down, but they also have a book club where every week they put out a different book, so you can go and sit down and have a read of a different book that you might have available. And you'll see in the top left corner a parklet that has been put up. This one was actually funded by the council but has been adapted by the local community. So there's been the addition of a marble run where kids can put marbles in and watch it run through different parts of the parklet. A 12-year-old girl who lives across the road painted, designed and installed a chessboard on the parklet. There's been the addition of a community notice board. And again, after complaints from some of the smaller residents that the seats were too high, a 30-centimetre high toddler chair for young children to be able to sit down on the parklet as well. These are just some of the interventions that have happened, not because there's been any particular focus on greening in Lambeth or in Railton LTN, but because of the simple fact that as soon as there was less car traffic, people felt like they had more of an ownership over their space, and they took that and went running with it. I'll finish with my favorite example of the sort of interventions that I've seen in, this is in Railton LTN, this is in Tulse Hill LTN, which is just around the corner. When Christmas happened and lockdown was announced, and lots of people in this community, like communities all over London, realised that they wouldn't be going home for Christmas, and they weren't going to be able to see their families, and they were sort of going to be stuck locally again in a dreary London winter. A local group came up with the idea for a scavenger hunt, or like a little adventure hunt. So they organised these maps, and they developed what is here the 12 Days of Christmas sort of adventure run through the LTN. So it's based on that 12 Days of Christmas song with the five golden rings that everyone loves singing about. So what you can see on this planter here is the ladies are leaping, and in the top left corner, the partridge in a pear tree that someone in their spare time made out of paper mache, got a tree, added it into the planter, put on some fake pears, and all for the simple fact of trying to give their community a little bit of extra joy and happiness at Christmas time. So basically what I want you to sort of leave my 10 minutes thinking about is the fact that communities in London and all over the UK have so much creativity and so much energy and so much potential for taking ownership of their spaces and for turning them from grey to green and to rainbow and to paper mache and to all of these other things. And a lot of the time they don't need much more than being told it's okay and having people move out of the way and allowing that to happen. So I think wherever possible, giving communities permission to sort of take ownership of their spaces like this could be really transformational for London and for the greening of our city. But that's it from me. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm really impressed by the power of the toddler lobby, that you've clearly, that they're making a difference. But also it'd be interesting to see how people respond to the, ask permission afterwards, as opposed to before you do things. We've had quite a few issues and questions which have come up in the Q&A. So if the presenters want to put themselves back on screen again, let's try and get through a bunch of these and see how we get on. But thanks everyone for the richness of what you presented, and lots of really practical stories there. It wasn't at all theoretical, but obviously there's a bigger story into which this is fitting. Some of the questions sort of come out of, I suppose, the experience of lockdown and the interventions that local authorities have made, and some of them are sort of being undone So, I mean, Catherine and Cranston and Keith Ashendon's sort of question really boils down to, what will influence a local authority? And given there's experience of them sort of opening up roads which were closed, despite the benefits of them being closed, or the planning powers that they've got available, or how they've missed out important parts of their local area. Would anyone want to give a take on what should people be doing to influence their local authority to move from grey to green? Who wants to kick off? I can see Alice is burning to say something. Go on,
Yes, I mean,
Alice.
it's obviously it's a hugely political issue. Space is, space. Some people feel that it's space for not for cars. A lot of people feel that should be space for cars. And I think the point is really that nobody, that we all understand that cars are needed. People need access, and we're not stopping cars. It's just that what we're stopping is certain car journeys. We're encouraging people to change car journeys away from short trips to use a walking or cycling or more active travel or even public transport. And also we're not stopping people from accessing their houses or anything in reallocating road space. Really what we're trying to do is to make space for pedestrians and cyclists as well. I mean, that's the low traffic neighbourhood debate. I mean, the much bigger issue is really about running a city, a compact city. You can't run an efficient city with cars. The mayor has been very clear about that. That I think Ben mentioned that there is a target to move from what we currently have, which is 40% of trips made by car, to just 20% of trips made by car. That's a big change that we all need to get on board with. And of course, most people who don't have access to a car are people who are in low income groups, who are older people who no longer want to drive or are not able to drive, younger people who may not yet be able to afford a car, or indeed who are teenagers who just want to be able to travel independently and safely. Yeah. So I think there is a much wider context to this debate that we all have to take on board.
Ben, could I get you to come in on this? Because obviously you have to work through boroughs, don't you? And leaving aside the fact you give them some money to do some stuff, you have to persuade them to want to do things. So what works for you?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, to take specifically the example of the some of the street space measures and low traffic neighborhoods, obviously, yeah, London is a complex beast when it comes to governance. So obviously my work sits within the GLA, within the environment team, obviously leading on those transport measures and street closures is TfL that has responsibility for that. And then the roads in London are a mixture of those roads which are managed at the borough level, which is most roads in London, and then the red routes, the Transport for London road network, which is directly managed by TfL. So I think as Alice said, the policy framework is there around those objectives to reduce the amount of car use and to increase walking, cycling, and public transport. So those kind of top level ambitions are there, but the implementation of those does happen at the local level, and that can be complex. And I think from the perspective of the GLA, and thinking kind of more broadly, not just on streets, but our work as the environment team and the green infrastructure team, there's a mixture. There's the policies, and obviously the London plan is something which has more force, has more weight. Then there's funding programs as well, and they aren't always as large as we'd like, but hopefully in the new mayoral term we'll be bringing forward some funding programs which can support exemplar projects, which can then hopefully demonstrate what can be done. And then there's the work that kind of I touched on today, which is about the advocacy and making the case and demonstrating the benefits. So kind of adding weight to those policies and showing what can be done. But yeah, it's complicated, it's complex what is delivered at the London-wide level and at the local level. But certainly, yeah, most, for closing streets, it is the local authority that's probably has the most weight and is the place to go.
One of the things that came through from your presentations was the evidence that exists, whether it be the evidence you presented, Stephen, or Ben, you know, the evidence about value, the return on investment, the evidence as someone put in the Q&A around shared space. We're not short of evidence that this stuff is good for you. Is there some evidence missing? Is it that evidence doesn't work? Stephen, do you want to come in on that?
I think there's two problems here. First of all, there's a body of evidence around the economic impact of some of these schemes, and Living Streets has done a lot of research on this. I draw everyone's attention to our pedestrian pound research that shows that most retailers overestimate how many people drive to their premises. Most people walk to shops, and people that walk to shops spend more and make more trips. So the evidence is out there. But the other thing we have to confront is a lot of myths. And that myth busting is just as important as making sure that everyone knows the evidence, and kind of myths around the impact on emergency vehicle response times, for example, and other areas are things that we've been keen to address. And we have actually produced a document on this, which there was a link to in my presentation, which I'd encourage everyone to look at, just looking at where the facts are, what the facts are, and kind of what the myths are that they're trying to address. I think the other area that kind of flows from some of the comments Ben was making and came through in Sarah's presentation as well is around political courage as well. There was no shortage of people supporting many of these schemes, but kind of we hear very much from the loud voice, especially on social media. So ensuring we can give a voice to those that are quieter, I think, is a critical thing to do, and that's where the work of campaigners such as Sarah is so critical.
Sorry.
Yep. Go for it.
I'd like to put forward that perhaps it's the way it's done. So I'm going to put two very contrasting methods. One being the Extinction Rebellion closures of Oxford Street and Oxford Circus Marble Arch. Throughout that, there were proven measurements taken of the air quality improvements and the health benefits. However, the West End team, or the West End bid, loudly said we've been down in takings, we've had less people, yet every year the Crown Estate casually closed swathes of the West End for car-free days, populations, both of which doing exactly the same things. Is it just because there's a orthodox and unorthodox way of doing it? Or, we're having a conversation about closing Oxford Street for the last 30 years. I don't think it made a huge difference to those or inconvenience those for the week that it was closed during Extinction Rebellion. Yet we could do it for 4 weekends over a month with the Crown Estate. So I'm just playing devil's advocate, perhaps, that trade or economics per se, and Ben was showing some good examples of the health benefits and that knock-on effect on the economy through the welfare state or social infrastructure. So it's just seeing how we play it. I just thought I'd throw that in the mix.
Yeah, I mean, Mac and Sarah, you've had to deal with, I suspect it's not been completely universal, adulation for everything that you've been involved in. I suspect there's been the odd voice which is sort of asked questions. How have you managed that at a very sort of at a community, at a street level, where you get different opinions coming forward?
I think for me, and to sort of pick up on a few things that have been said so far, it's about not looking at any of these interventions through too narrow of a lens. So it's one of the reasons that I'm so excited to see CPRE taking this on, is because if we look at this just through a transport perspective, if we look at this just through saying, let's close streets to cars so we can, or like, obviously that's not how it is actually happening, but it's how it's framed. So let's go with that line. Let's close streets to cars so we can open them up for people who walk or cycle. So, you know, a year ago, I'd never ridden a bike in London, and the idea of me riding a bike in London was preposterous, and I would have laughed in your face if you'd suggested that it would have been something I would have been able to do. A low traffic neighborhood came in, and now I cycle everywhere. It's my main way of getting around, helped me build up the confidence. But if I had been pitched an idea just on the sole merit of it might be able to help people cycle, I would have thought, well, that's not me. That's not something that I'm ever going to benefit from. And it's one of the things that we've seen in our local area, and why I use the example of the greening, right? There are a lot of people in our community who just weren't fussed about the low traffic neighborhood. They were drivers, you know, they weren't seeing massive changes in their journey times, but they weren't going to cycle, they weren't going to walk, but they loved gardening. And then all of a sudden, this provided them with more opportunities to be greening the area, to be gardening, to be making their home look like that. And now they're really staunch advocates for low traffic neighborhoods and for these changes, because they don't want that thing to go. So the question that I always ask myself, the sort of thought experiment that I like to do is, you know, what if these changes were actually a health policy and they were coming in from the NHS? What would they highlight? What if it was something that was coming in from Age UK, who was talking about being able to age independently and with dignity and being able to get around even when you don't have a driver's license? What if it was in terms of education and children's right to independence? What if it was an economic argument? We were talking about the fact that Stephen said that more people get to the shops on foot than they do by car, and they tend to make more trips and spend more overall. So doing that sort of, you know, sometimes I'll have a free evening and I'll go, how would a librarian advocate for a low traffic neighborhood? You know, thinking about all of these different things and sort of trying to meet people where they're at, instead of trying to say to them, this could benefit you too. You just can't understand it now, or you can't imagine it now, because that's just, you know, too big of a leap for people to make, especially at times like these.
So could I just ask you to pick up, there was a question aimed at you from Hugo, really asking, was there a point at which the community sort of reached a critical mass of support, or are you being copied? You know, have you seen it being just copied elsewhere? Can you just describe, you know, almost the journey that of realizing that this thing was real and happening and for us?
Yeah, of course. So at first, so the worst time definitely was the first few weeks when the sat-nav companies hadn't sort of updated their information yet, and there was absolute bedlam. I still remember going down to a street to check out the new planters and having a woman, you know, understandably hysterically upset because her cat had been killed in some of the like U-turning and all of that sort of stuff process, and just thinking like, oh my God, this is awful and should have been done better. The sort of situation in Lambeth is a little bit of a weird one, because for a whole bunch of reasons that I don't understand, actual enforcement of the low traffic neighbourhoods here didn't start for about 6 months after they had already been installed. So there was huge community change before there was any sort of economic repercussions and fines for people, which was really interesting to see. And I think, you know, for the first sort of 3 to 4 months especially, we had lots of problems with things like vandalism and with sort of loud complaints. But once things started to settle down, once schools went back and people started being able to do the school run a lot better with their kids, and you'd start seeing sort of kids riding the bikes on the roads with their families and having a wonderful time in that sort of sense, the sort of public support for it has really picked up. And you know, people start to see those knock-on effects. There's a local councillor around here who started out being really skeptical about the changes because he drove most of the time, and he's lost 2 stone since the LTN was introduced because he started walking so much more. And all of a sudden, you know, his opposition to it isn't as strong as it used to be. And that's what you see, you know, in so many cases throughout the UK of when these interventions have been put in, right? No one in Waltham Forest is asking for the low traffic neighbourhoods there to be removed. And given time, things do calm down, where a year next month out from the introduction of our low traffic neighbourhood here in Railton, and I think the last survey that was done had 75% of people in support. So, you know, I'd be absolutely flabbergasted if it was removed. It's a like cornerstone of our community now, and people are innovating and building off of it. And if you know, I ever talk to anyone who asks, how can I make sure these changes in my area aren't reversed? I say, you know, make it your own, adapt it, build life around it, and give people things they're really attached to that wouldn't be possible if it wasn't there anymore.
Thank you. Mac, did you want to come in on any of this?
So is that me?
It was, yes. I'm just asking, do you want to come in?
Yes. Well, I live locally, Sarah, so I do know about the negative voices. And I'm actually someone that's suffered from an awful lot of traffic that's now on my road because it's not on the other road. So I'm very respectful of what you're doing, but it's not a silver bullet, evidently. And actually what it is there's just too many cars on the road. And ultimately that's the problem. So all your good work in some way, and I'm obviously not pro car in that way, but I have now suffered extra pollution because of it. So it's going to eventually, you know, calm down. And so I do feel that the other voices need to be listened to. And this is something that Will and I have experienced when we've done schemes, is that there is that moment where you have to break some eggs to make an omelette. And the breaking of the eggs can get people sort of up in arms in some way. And you've just got to keep believing in what you're doing, and also be prepared in Will and I's case, from schemes that we've done, to make changes accordingly if they're needed. And this is what I'm talking when I was referring to the presentation of meaningful community engagement. It really does have to be, you know, you really need to listen, and it's a tricky one. But I'm very respectful, Sarah, of your work. I wanted to answer a question in regards to somebody's put in the Q&A panel in regards to Gail Verdi, shouldn't weeds plants be allowed to grow up beside in between pavements? There is actually now a movement. I'm also a co-director of the Incredible but Edible Lambeth, and we're trying to get a campaign. Well, we are doing a campaign at the moment, because the way Lambeth Council has it, if you don't want weed killer sprayed on your street, you have to get your street together to tell them you don't want it to be sprayed on your street. And what we want to do is turn that round and say to Lambeth, make us tell you we want you to spray poisonous weed killer on our street. And you'll guess what? This thunderous silence will appear, because people won't be asking that. So yes, of course we should, and what is a weed anyway but a plant that is regarded in the wrong place? Growing up in between pavements, well, yeah, that trip hazards, things like that. But if they're being walked on, they won't grow. It's up at the sides. It's those wonderful dandelions you see sprouting tenaciously in between curbstones. So yes, I do think that. So that's my question answered for the evening.
Thank you. I'll come to you, Alice. But Mac, would you mind also just picking up on this one, which is a similar point, but different scale? Elizabeth Silver's asked, basically, if we're building loads of tall buildings, is it going to be too dark down at the street level to cope with all this greenery? Is that an issue? And is it being dealt with when those questions are sort of being raised when those developments are being put forward?
The right to light issue is huge, absolutely. And the amount of daylight hours, sunlight you actually get. And it's something in Brixton we're going through a lot with. I can count at least 5 towers that are currently in planning. And the right to light will definitely cause an awful lot of disruption, including on the curb garden, which was part of our presentation. There's going to be a huge 16-story, unless the local activists, which I'm part of, can stop this. But yeah, I don't know what the knock-on effect will be locally, but I'm sure, Will, you probably know better than I that it does actually make a difference to these sort of interventions with pocket parks, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I think we're seeing a shift in the density of housing, but I'm sure Ben's team at the GLA will have a bigger, kind of more comprehensive view of that. But you know, with Grenfell and various things, people are looking at living in different sites where they can, obviously, and people often don't have the choices, which is perhaps the bigger challenge. You can't, you know, you wouldn't choose to live in a bad neighborhood or a less green neighborhood if you had the chance, but some aren't that privileged. So we have to work with the microclimates, and you know, I'm working on a couple of projects where the planners, because the architects have designed it in such a way, are stipulating that I have to provide a much more comprehensive planting palette to prove that they'll survive. And so it's almost, you know, I would say there needs to be some sort of landscape. We're always, I would say, the last in and the first out when it comes to value engineering. And I hope through the reevaluation and the period of lockdown, we start to put landscape at the forefront with architecture and urban design to create holistic spaces. And I know there are some pioneering work being done in London, but once we step outside of London, those developers are still the pile them high and sell them quick kind of models.
Yeah.
So
And presumably wind and overheating and other things,
Yeah,
you know, add
exactly.
to that, as well as the light. Alice, I know you were trying to get in.
Yeah, so I mean, I think to bring us back to the use of space in London and how kind of being a Londoner and having been a Londoner for all my life, and given that I'm much older than I look, I can tell you that, you know, that London, I've watched London fill up with cars from a point when there weren't that many actually, and I think historically we've just kind of let it happen, and that's just been history. That's just how it's happened. But we've just kind of realized that for so many reasons, we've now, and you know, we've just let both parking and cars take over space, and that has so many impacts. It's hard to, you know, it's hard to know where to start. So, you know, fundamentally, we can't run a city around cars. They're just inefficient of space. But they also have so many impacts on us. And most recently, you know, having just kind of stopped having to hold the hand of my kids to cross the road, I was with my father, who's now old, and wandered into a road and nearly, you know, didn't see anything coming. And it's just, you know, there's so many ways in which it impacts people, and in particular vulnerable people. And so I think, you know, the environmental and social impacts of enabling a car dependent city are just kind of secondary almost to the economic impacts.
Yeah.
But we, you know, all of them are just huge, and we simply have to address them.
One of the issues that's come up in the Q&A on cars, because obviously one of the responses that people give to that is, oh, well, we're all going to be moving to electric cars. And Cynthia Jenkins and Carol Dest have both asked the questions about, will the growth in electric cars result in the loss of front gardens as people want to plug in at home, more crossovers? You know, how does that change the sort of street morphology in a way that, does that help, or does that, I suspect behind the question is, does it hinder some of the moves towards greening? Where do people stand on that one, between two goods? Apparently, you know, electric cars are seen as a good, but are they when it comes to greening?
Well, I think fundamentally, to start with, we need to remember that, you know, in inner London boroughs now, something like 70% of households don't have a car. So I think ultimately that's the way that we're heading. But obviously, you know, cars that don't pollute where they are needed are much better than cars that do. That's.
I think that's one of the ideas that's worth challenging in a way, because one of the things that I've only learned about really recently is the fact that in a lot of the pollution that London deals with, especially air pollution, electric cars aren't going to be the sort of solution to that problem that everyone hopes. The sort of fine particle pollution that comes off tires and comes off brake dust is still going to be a really big problem with electric cars, potentially even a bigger problem in the sense that they're heavier and, you know, they break more in that sort of the electric sense. And I noticed someone in the chat talking about charging in pedestrian places. You know, my father-in-law uses a wheelchair, and navigating a sidewalk with him is incredibly difficult already without adding a sort of charging point every few meters. And I think that that's why I think it's so important at this point in time that we do everything that we can to entice people out of cars, particularly before the ultra low emission zone comes in. I 100% agree with what Michaela said earlier, that the problem is too many cars, 100% too many cars. And we need to be thinking about not only how do we introduce these sticks that get people out of cars, but also how do you introduce carrots? How do you say, you know, trade in your car, you can get a subscription to a car share service or a cargo bike or an e-bike or different things that will make it possible, so we don't find ourselves 10 years from now with just as many cars in the city. They just don't make as much noise as they did before.
Thanks, Stephen.
Couldn't agree with Sarah more. I think electric cars are still cars and they still cause congestion. The electricity has to come from somewhere, and it's often coming from non-renewable sources, and there's still particulate matter, and they still cause collisions as well. The other issue we hear a lot from our members on is pavement clutter, and the pavement clutter caused by charging points in particular. And some London boroughs are very good, and the TfL guidance on where to put charging points is very good as well, but we still see too many charging points put in the middle of the pavement where they could easily just be put in the carriageway. take space away from the cars rather than away from pedestrians who need as much space as they can get, especially those in wheelchairs or with sight impairment.
Can I move us on to another issue? And Ben, this might come to you first. Catherine Teeling has been asking about whether basically do we have the information we need, the mapping data, the data about what the potential is of different locations. I mean, the GLA has this vast databases of information, but does it have what it needs, and is it being applied in the right way, or are there gaps there that need to be filled?
Yeah, so we do have a lot of information, and I think sometimes it's about using that information in the most useful way to help people make decisions. So there's a few different sources of information. So one is around where do we want to target? Where are these interventions turning grey to green most needed? And we've published some data sets recently which bring together different sources of data to help inform that question. So we've got what's called our green infrastructure focus map, which highlights those places in London which are in most need of greening, bringing together information on access to public open space, on air quality, on flood risk, to highlight those parts of London which would benefit most from greening. And often that greening, those locations are densely populated urban areas where there isn't necessarily the opportunity to create a large new park, but actually repurposing streets, repurposing the public realm is where those opportunities are. And we've just published something similar as well on climate vulnerability, which brings together information on both the kind of climate risks in locations, so from urban heat island, flood risk, lack of shade, but also the vulnerabilities. So where do those Londoners live who are potentially more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change? So older Londoners, younger Londoners. So those kind of tools and bringing together that data in a useful form, which can be both used by ourselves and by boroughs to, for example, prioritize funding programs, but then can also be, making that accessible, so that people who want to do things in their own neighbourhoods can use that information to campaign for change or to put together proposals. I mean, just to pick up notice, one of the other questions was about the data and the kind of modeling around the benefits. So I think those kind of methodologies are improving all the time. So as I said, we worked on this piece of work, we're working with Vivid Economics, who are kind of a consultancy that specializes in this type of work. And they have significant databases. So for example, to try and get those calculations of the benefits based on population, based on a model which incorporates data from lots of real green spaces, and what are the characteristics, what's the size, what's the location, and based on those things, what kind of how many visitors would you expect to reach, and also incorporates information from national surveys, so like the Monitor of Engagement with Natural Environment survey that the government does. So those all kind of bring together so that you can then start to apply them to these theoretical scenarios. But the key then, I think, as well, is where some of these schemes are then delivered, is collecting the data on their impact and on their use and on who's using those spaces as well, to try and get that really kind of more fine-grained to then feed back into those decision-making processes. So yeah, I think there's a lot of data, and the data that we have is improving. But it's about, I think, using it in an intelligent way, and it doesn't necessarily tell you exactly what to do. It helps to inform your decisions alongside a lot of other factors.
Thanks, Ben. Stephen, could I ask you this one, because you do a lot of work around the sort of kids getting to school at Living Street. So there's a question from Anne Cranston really around, could you start by looking at greening routes from bus stops near schools and grow out from there? Is that a way of prioritizing, or doesn't that work?
I think it does work. It highlights something we always say, though, which is it's about you need to look at the whole journey to school. So there's been a lot of focus at the moment on school street schemes, so closure of streets that schools are on, around pick up and drop off time, and those schemes are absolutely fantastic, but they need to be seen as part of wider area solutions to reduce vehicles, to slow speeds and make streets safer for children as well. So yes, look at bus stops and look at how they can be green, especially for secondary school children who will have larger catchment areas, but also look at the other bits of that walk, the crossings, the traffic volumes, the school street, and make sure that everything's working together appropriately to make the journey to school as safe as possible and as clean as possible.
Any other views on sort of how we prioritize where to do this? I mean, clearly there's a lot going on, but you know, is the route through with schools? Is it those massive, great car parks that Alice showed us? You know, shared city and land, particularly on the urban fringe. You know, is there anything which should be steering us as to where we should be focusing our efforts? So Ben and his colleagues, you know, are supporting things in the areas that are going to take the right priority. Will?
We've been doing a lot of work with sort of academics and research bodies actually to give us the data or help us gather the data to inform the design decisions that we make. And we've been working with a neuroscience-based lab based out of UCL called the Centric Lab, and they look at urban environmental stresses and the effects that they have on the communities that we're working within. So they gather a lot of data, but they also not only have the data, but they then do community sovereignty workshops, which actually look at how you embody or give the people the confidence and understanding of what that stuff is doing to them so that they can have a voice and be more involved in the process. And I think that is where you sort of have the guidance documents, the data, and then you've got to give that to the people. So it's sort of meeting top down and bottom up. And I think that's been a really exciting part of the way we've been working. We've been working with another team from Liverpool called the Inclusionaries, and that's looking at how you would do more engagement through, again, academic research. So you're looking at data-driven stuff to inform the designs. And I think it's where those dots need to be joined up. And I think there's a lot of people on the panel that are thinking about it, but it's still influencing the key decision makers, whether that's developers. And I know TfL have got their kind of new KPIs that are coming out with Healthy Streets and the suite that we've been involved in a little bit as well. But it's really sort of holding people to account to say, look, we've got a lot of big challenges ahead. Climate change is one. We've just been through a pandemic. Health is critical. And if we start looking at how health, social infrastructure, welfare, etc., joins up and we see the benefits as the data is coming out, we will really start to have a much more cohesive way of designing the cities that we live in.
Matt?
Yes, it's a multi-agency approach, and local authorities often don't communicate in between their own departments. So we need to join up all those dots, as Will said. On a physical level, I would say, Stephen, you just mentioned, is it school routes? Yes, I think that's a really good place to start, because one thing we have seen over and over again is children don't really need to have much said to them about getting their hands dirty and getting involved with gardening. If you catch them young enough, they totally get it and they want to be part of it. And, you know, the growing of food in schools, for instance, and more school gardens is really helping open up those minds that otherwise don't necessarily have gardens at home. So I would say, yes, school routes are a great place to start, right there on the street, highly visible, public facing.
Thanks, Matt. Alice, I think were you trying to get in then to Ben?
Yeah, just to not lose sight of the people who are already managing without cars, and that is an enormous number of people, even in outer London, 30% of households, and to just emphasise, yeah, that it's possible and that we should listen to those people. And I think one important thing that we really have to do is to amplify those voices, which is, I think, something that Stephen said. And, you know, for those of us who may be car users, it's very hard to imagine life without, but actually so many people do manage without, and sometimes it's not easy, and we need to make it easier for them and hear from them.
And Ben, thanks, Alice.
Yeah, just to go back to a point which several people have made, but I think in terms of prioritization and where efforts are focused, I think addressing some of the fundamental inequalities in access to green space, which, you know, cut across social inequalities and health inequalities as well. You know, it really is, it is a matter of social justice. You know, we know that, you know, more deprived neighbourhoods in London are less likely to have good access to green space and have poorer air quality. We know that Black, Asian and minority ethnic Londoners are more likely to live in those areas and also are less likely to have garden space. And so I think really, you know, really taking that focused look at where we prioritise, so that we are, you know, when we're having these conversations and thinking about turning grey to green and creating a network of green spaces and green infrastructure, that really is to benefit all Londoners. And I think that, you know, that is gonna, I think the pandemic and the focus that's put on access to green space has really, you know, that's, it's not, those of us who are, you know, involved in this space know that that is an issue, but I think it's become much more apparent to a wider range of people. I think that's really important that we retain that focus.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to, I think we've done what we can with the questions. I'm going to ask each of you, if I may, and we'll go through the order that we, the presentations were done in. If you could just in 30 seconds, give us your favourite example of something that's being gone from grey to green, and feel free to roam across the world. Don't feel like you have to be in London. You may have examples from elsewhere. And what one thing do you think would most quickly accelerate the move from grey to green? And Stephen, I'm afraid you're first.
Always the unfortunate problem with going first. I'm going to think back to our Living Streets Walking Summit in March, and we took advantage of the pandemic and the fact that everyone was virtual to hear from some really great international speakers as well as national speakers. And there were some really wonderful examples of kind of small Spanish towns that were going from grey to green in a way that I couldn't possibly have imagined, places that you won't have heard of. They would be, and I encourage you to go on our website and look at the highlights of that conference.
Great. Okay,
some
that's
great cities where they were moving cars away.
And what one thing could be done?
I think the big thing is the art of the possible. We at Living Streets, we focus on everyday journeys, and those journeys that people could easily walk that they currently drive. Not the longer journeys or the journeys with heavy shopping or whatever that people find a bit more challenging, but what one journey, whether it be the walk to school, the walk to the bus stop, the walk to the train station that you drive, could you easily switch over, and that would make a massive difference if everyone did that.
Good one. Alice?
Yeah, so the one thing that I would like to see, the one space is that massive car park and retail, car dependent retail park in Enfield to become a wonderful new neighbourhood. And I think the one thing that I would like to see happen all over London is to make buses run, is to remove anything that is in the way of buses, because that's absolutely fundamental to London, and get rid of the parking. If we can create a bus lane instead of allowing or enabling private cars to park, then those private car parking spaces just should go, in my view, to enable bus routes.
Thank you. Ben?
For an example, I'm going to use one from outside of London, which is Queen Square in Bristol, which is the kind of centre of George and Bristol, and used to have a massive road ploughing through the middle of it. I've seen pictures of it. When I first saw them, I couldn't believe it, because it's such a fantastic space now, which is so well used, and the centre for so much going on there. So it's a great example. One thing I would say, valuing the benefits that green space and green infrastructure can bring, and thinking about that as a critical infrastructure for the city, just the same as transport, as sewage, as electricity, as everything else.
Thanks. Mac?
I'm going to go international and say the High Line in New York. It's an absolutely fantastic example of a space. Yes, it was green actually, but it wasn't accessible. And now it's provided an incredible accessible space for with increased biodiversity, amazing biophilic benefits for the people of New York City. That's got to be a win-win all round. And there's certainly plenty of examples, including, for instance, the Peckham Coal Line. That is a work in process. We could do it here in London. My one thing Well, I'm going to say, returning to our presentation with our kit of parts and our tessellated units, and how you can put these mini gardens and then move them around neighborhoods and whet people's appetite so they can actually see what it's like to have it and then take it away.
Okay, well, you can't have that one, so you need to have something else.
I guess I'm going to go for more of a kind of topical thing, that we here are pretty much all white, I would say middle class, and to make the changes, as we all design cities for everyone, we need to, and we are public practice, design council experts, the Developer magazine doing a lot of work about equity and equality and diversity. But ultimately, if we are to really design meaningful change, we have to really get people from the ground up to work through, through teaching, through secondary education, through higher education or apprentice schemes, to get them in the room so that they can be part of the conversation. And that's gender equality, diversity, cultural backgrounds, etc. And I think it's happening, but if we are to do it properly, then it needs to be fully representative of everyone in society.
Thanks, Will. And Sarah?
I'm going to go international as well. Everything that's happening in Paris, but especially the big things that are happening on the Champs-Élysées and all the sort of main roads, and what we're going to be seeing in terms of greening there is just like incredibly inspirational. One thing, I've got this recent obsession that what if we change the definition of car? So what if we kept all of our parking policy the same and all of that sort of thing, but that public space was available for use for greening or for storing a bike or for different things like that, that we didn't need a different permit. You just, in a CPZ, that small block of public space was available for you to do what you wanted with it, as long as it was productive for the community. I think we could make massive changes very quickly if we started thinking about that.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for all those presentations and for dealing with those issues and questions so well. For those who've asked, I believe your presentations will be made available in due course online, but there'll be the event itself will also be available online if people want to go back and review things. So we're going to draw things to a close now. Thanks everyone for attending. Don't miss out on the Urban Tree Festival. Check out on the programme there. If you're not a member of CPRE London, then please, we'd love you to join our increasingly diverse membership. We want you to stay in touch. Don't wait till next year. We're doing things now, and we'd love you to be involved in whatever way you feel you can. Thanks very much for attending, and please have good evenings. Cheerio.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.